Here we go. Welcome, everyone, to this session on injecting science into the art of relationship building. We're going to just start with a snap poll. Who here in the room, we'll include you guys, has experienced in the last 2.5 days a moment of joy as you rekindled a relationship with someone in person that you hadn't seen yeah, good, thank you. Who in the room has met someone new that seems like, oh, this could be the start of a beautiful new relationship? And who in this room, reflecting back on the last 18 months, has observed at some point in those 18 months, you know, what this has really surfaced for me is about the power of relationships. Have we all said that? Yes, we have all said that. Relationships, you know, are having a moment, and not only because COVID revealed how, useful in some ways Zoom was for doing that, but how much better it is when you can do it in person. But also because there's a current of thinking and science now undergirding what we understand to be relationships' role in the learning process. Many of you, since you're here in this session, are probably aware of the work that Julia Freeland-Fisher has done. She wrote the book, Who You Know. That's all about thinking of relationships as an outcome, you know, social capital. And not merely as an input. This panel is going to talk about the expanding science on how important the quality of the relationship is between learner and teacher, mentor, guide, in enhancing and deepening the quality of the learning that goes on. And there's an expanding research base, and we have this killer all-star super friendly among them panel of experts. And I'm going to turn it to Scott, and we'll go down the row, and you guys can introduce yourselves.
Great, thanks, Andy. Good morning, everyone. Scott Frauenheim, proud CEO of Distinctive Schools. We are a nonprofit charter school management organization. We have 9 schools in Chicago and Detroit, and we've been on the personalized learning journey here for the past decade since founding in 2011.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Christina Theokas. I'm the Chief Applied Science Officer at Turnaround for Children. We translate neuroscience, developmental science, learning science into tools and resources for educators, and then we partner with educators to use those tools to transform their schools around healthy whole child development and thriving.
Great. I'm Samia Zaidi, and I work at Gradient Learning, a nonprofit organization that focuses on tools for teachers that are designed to help them meet the holistic needs of every child. And specifically, I'm the program director for our new teacher tool, Along, which is a free digital reflection tool designed for teachers to help students feel seen and heard and open up in the classroom.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jilliam Joe. I represent Leap Innovations. I'm the head of research. We have, since 2014, infused innovation in classrooms and schools to change learning from a one-size-fits-all model to one that truly customizes learning experiences so that each individual child's potential is revealed and elevated. And personally, I see the work that I do as helping to fulfill my purpose in ensuring that every child, especially Black and brown children, have an effective teacher, have an effective educator in their classroom so that their full potential can be realized.
So I hope you caught all that. The ASU folks, Emily, where are you, who built this panel. You know, we've got the, practitioner here, and we've got the scientist here, and we've got the tool builder here, and network builder, and the researcher over there. So this is very artfully designed up here. That leaves me, I'm not quite sure what my role is, except to catalyze these people to have a great conversation. I'm Andy Calkins. I'm the co-director of Next Gen Learning Challenges. We're a national nonprofit that has the luck and good fortune of working with people like this to help move education out of the 1920s. So we're going to start really big. What lies behind the power of relationships? Why are they so important? Everybody who's come to this session already kind of knows that. So I'm going to ask you, and Christina, we'll start with you, to go especially into, what is the science that says the power and quality of the relationships actually has a palpable effect on the depth of the learning that happens?
Yeah, sure, I can jump in. And so I think there's two different strands of research, and I want to start with the brain science and what relationships actually do to the brain that we've been able to learn and see and understand much better. I think, as Andy said, it's not controversial that relationships are important, but the idea that they are actually fully engineered and integrated into learning settings is where the gap exists. And so understanding the science and what the science tells us is happening, I think, helps us to think about how we actually build those relationships that do catalyze learning and development in the way that we know that they can. So to give the simplest example, if we think about an infant and we think about what we call serve and return interactions, so the child is expressing a need and someone in the environment is responding to that need. It's a serve and return. That sets up the architecture of our brain in a way that further helps the future learning and growth of who we are as people. So starting with the early infant attachment and that serve and return starts building the brain architecture. And then as we have more and new relationships founded on trust and engagement, the brain continues to build in that way, and it builds in an integrated way. So our social, emotional, affective, neural architecture is being developed through relationships that we have. And then we have all sorts of other research that shows how deeply we know kids actually improves academic achievement. So I think the thing to remember at the outset is that relationships aren't separate from kids' learning. It actually catalyzes kids' learning through the development of the brain architecture.
Thank you. So I love that. It's the first time I've heard serve and return, and as a every weekend tennis player, I'm just like loving that. So Scott, you're the practitioner here. Let's take what Christina just said and move into what this actually looks like in practice. Are you taking all your kids out to the tennis court or what?
We need to be doing that.
Yeah,
we definitely
apparently,
need to be.
it's the science.
We're very grateful for Christina leading us with the science and helping us to inform the what and the why of how we're doing things in our classrooms. And so for us at Distinctive, we're really thinking about relationships at the heart of everything that we do. Culture is a big part of our work, and so deep relationships, being able to connect at a deep level, really helps us move the work and making sure that we're all aligned. Recovering from COVID, obviously all of us are thinking about how we're reopening, how we're bringing kids back together, and what the relationship looks like between teacher and student. And so we're proud of what we're doing around the work around empathy interviews and relationship building and mentoring. And then we think back to even 5 years ago around some of those practices that we were not doing and wondering why, and then thinking about hundreds and hundreds of years of education and how that has been absent or void in the work that we're doing. And so as we think about returning, using our learner profile work through our personalized learning work with Leap Innovations and being really thoughtful about learner connected between teacher and student, using empathy interviews with every single teacher and every single student, modeling for teachers what an empathy interview looks like and feels like with our school leaders, some of them in the room, to be able to really help teachers think about what a deep relationship looks like and not just caring and loving and thinking about sympathy versus empathy, aligned to some of the equity work, which I know we'll get into in a little bit. But empathy interviews, learner profiles, really identifying student strengths, interests, passions, to really be able to drive the relationship forward and deeper around especially identifying their needs as we reopen and think about learning acceleration, mental health, and social emotional learning as three of our big priorities.
Great, thank you. And so, Scott, you referenced Leap, a big partner of yours in all this. So, Jilliam, let's go to you next. You and Leap are thinking about, doing this across 90, 120, however many schools it is now. What does that look like to take this germ of practice?
We've been very privileged to work with schools and the distinctive networks and innovative schools, schools and educators who are willing to take risks and doing learning differently. One of the projects that I have the privilege of working on at LEAP is the development of our teaching framework. And the point of the teaching framework is to point educators to not necessarily entirely new practices, but more finely honed practices that take them out of the traditional stand and deliver, stage on stage model to one that truly prioritizes getting to know the student, their needs, interests, and strengths, and then leveraging that information for the purpose of helping to strengthen that child's educational journey, the learning pathway. And so where relationship comes into play here is in our teaching framework, one of our very first domains is establishing positive relationships, where we delve into issues of equity. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but just how important it is for educators to not only understand equity as a concept, but to also embrace the journey of unpacking class and bias and privilege and its influence on teaching and learning, and how in particular it affects students and students of color and how they show up in the classroom and how they show up in learning spaces and are received and believe that they matter in learning spaces. So I love what Christina says about the science behind relationships and how, in particular, it helps to undermine some of those traumas, and we'll get to it. But relationships are just so incredibly important, and which is why we've prioritized relationships, getting to know the student, empathy walks, and our frameworks, our teaching frameworks, and then the work that we do with educators.
Thank you for raising the whole question of equity and all of that. We're going to come back and spend some time on that. Let me go a little bit deeper. So you're seeing this being presented to and absorbed by lots of teachers across all of the schools in your network. What kind of reactions are you getting from them? I mean, do they say, "Well, duh, relationships," I do that all the time. It's who I am. It's natural. And then do you have to work to convince them that there's actually a set of practices that are specific and would enhance their ability to do that?
No, I don't think any teacher enters into the profession without, wanting to prioritize a relationship with children, right? Having a relationship. It's more so the how. How do I have a deep relationship with this child? How do I get to understand this child deeply? And of course, it's an exchange. So how in this relationship can the child understand themselves more deeply too? Across a classroom of 25 plus children, it's the how. How do I scale relationship building, quality relationship building across my classroom? Given the other demands on my time, given accountability demands, given various other demands. And so it's not so much having to convince them that relationships matter, which is great. It's more so having to your point, provide the strategies for how to do it thoughtfully and how to do it across a scale of 25 plus children. So we leverage tools like learner profile tools to help teachers to gather information about the student efficiently, but there's more work to do. I think I think that we've only scratched the surface with that particular tool, and I'm grateful that Samia will talk a little bit more about Along and how we can use technology to help that.
So let's do that. And Christina, did you want to jump in?
I was just going to jump in and add one thing. I think teachers believe in relationships, and I've had some recent conversations with educators. Also, we have a tool as well I can talk a little bit about later, the Wellbeing Index. And teachers are saying to me, I've always been really nice to my kids. I've always wanted to have relationships with them. But until I really stopped and thought about the kids in the relationship, I was really missing out. And there were things I didn't know or see about my kids that educators were leaning into that from their own perspective and what they needed and wanted to do, and being nice to kids and knowing who the kids were. And so when you stop and say, what are the key characteristics of a developmental relationship, not just a relationship? I had mentioned attachment as sort of like that first foundational one that we see is really important in infants, but continues through life. And then after that, it's the joint reciprocal interaction, so that back and forth, the serve and return, to going up to progressive complexity. So we're building skills in students' zone of proximal development, so we don't stay in the same place with the relationships, they change and adjust. And I think that that's what folks are talking about. How do we personalize, once we know kids, how do we personalize our interactions with them that meet them where they're at? And then as kids grow and develop, because it's developmental, the last is how do we start shifting the balance of power to kids too, where oftentimes oftentimes, classrooms and the system of education we have, it's often about compliance and behavior management, and adults hold the power, but we have to transition that to kids as they develop along the way. So there's something qualitatively different about a developmental relationship that really does catalyze that learning for kids, and helping educators know those sort of four sort of foundational things really helps them to say, okay, what practices do I do? How do I do these practices differently that I was invested in before that actually deepen the experience?
Can I just jump in really quickly? I think COVID helped to I won't say force, but in a lot of ways force theory into practice. I think COVID helped educators realize just how much relationships matter. And Zoom, I believe that educators leaned a lot on the relationships that they built prior to the pandemic to help to engage students and ensure that students were seen and heard during remote learning. But we heard from many educators that a lot of the relationships that they had with their students were deepened during remote learning because their children got to see their home environment, they got to see their children's home environment, and so it developed a great deal of empathy on both the students' part as well as the teachers' part. So, my hope, and I know we haven't, but my hope is that we'll take a lot of these insights around relationship building during COVID into this next era of learning.
Great, thank you. So Samia, building on these comments on either side of you, I mean, you've been working at building this tool along, and presumably building it out of science and experiences like what you've just heard for, to benefit the sprawling network that is the Summit Learning Network. So what does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're talking about developmental relationships, and that's really the foundation of what we brought into Along, because we said, how can we actually take technology and try to scale things we know teachers want to be doing, things that teachers are doing, standing at the door of your classroom and greeting every student by name, forming opportunities to ask an important question, a research-based question to students, and actually catalyze that opportunity for the student to open up. Those are practices that teachers want to be doing, but how can we make them scalable for teachers? And so what Along is designed to do is actually have those research-based questions available for a teacher so that they can select from those questions and actually model for a student through video or audio, actually responding to the question themselves, modeling what does it look like for me to start that shared reflection with the student, for me to open up and show you what I'm thinking about. A question like, what is something you really value and why? And now I am able to model that as an educator for my student, and then the student can come back to me in their own time, in their own way, video, audio, or text, and supplement all of the other time that I have with them in the classroom with that one-on-one opportunity for them to open up. And so what we're hearing here is this is just super important for us to be focusing on developmental relationships, but the how of how do we do this in a way that I can fit into my schedule, that I actually have data now. Did I talk to every single one of my students when I was a teacher? I never knew at the end of the week if I'd had a one-on-one connection with every single one of my students. And so that's what we're trying to bring into Along, is that process of shared reflection with every kid. How can I have that one-on-one check-in?
So is there anybody else on the panel who's got this nagging concern about introducing too much tech, into the art of relationship building? Or does this feel like a totally appropriate use of tech to provide that kind of data?
So Samia and I have talked about this a little bit because we don't want tech to replace relationships, and we don't want it to turn into a compliance tracking system of, have you talked to every single student this week? What was that interaction like? Reflect on it, and thinking about teacher time is the biggest piece of feedback we're getting from teachers of yes, we want to build relationships. Of course we do. We're here for that profession and that work, but how are we doing it? And so a lot of teachers are saying we need resources, we need a framework, we need questions to be able to be asked, because what does success criteria look like for a deep relationship? So I feel like we need to start there, and how do we not make it turn into a compliance tracking exercise of, did you contact 100% of parents? Did you contact 100% of kids this week? And not turning it into a compliance-driven task, but truly helping to develop the art of the relationship building.
Yeah, and I think we offer a lot of scaffolds for teachers of like sentence starters and opportunities to model what it looks like to answer that question yourself so that you can keep it feeling really authentic. We definitely know that there's so many different ways in the classroom every day that you're building that relationship, but how can you also bring that into something that feels scalable, feels manageable for me to be able to get to? And also just having like those resources at your fingertips, I think is something, we're going to Pinterest, we're going to Google, like, where do I go to find these questions, searching advisory on the internet, like actually having something there that I can turn to that is based in research is a way that we can use technology to actually superpower things teachers already want to be doing. And so I think, do we want tech to replace what's happening in the classroom? No, but how can we use it to add on to all of the things that we're doing and just make them even more efficient and available for teachers?
And so what I'm hearing both from Scott and you, Samia, is that we don't want tech to take teachers' agency from them. We don't want we don't want to rob them of their agency and their ability to craft and to be artful, right, in how they apply the science in their teaching. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think as you were talking about, COVID accelerated some things. COVID accelerated the use of technology as a tool to support instruction and relationship building as opposed to a replacement. I think sometimes we were thinking that tech was a replacement for teaching, but now with COVID, we're starting to use it as a tool for us, and I'm hopeful that it can be used as a tool to help integrate these things into practices, and that's the gap that we face, right? Like a teacher has 120 kids, how do they do it for 120 kids? A tech tool can help integrate it into the experience and smooth that across the course of a day. So I agree with you wholeheartedly, Scott. We don't want it to become compliance-based and accountability-based. We're going to hold you accountable for this, but how do we use it? How do we use it for reflection and taking better action in the classrooms to get to outcomes we really care about?
So one thing we're thinking about, maybe we need help with this, is who has the relationship. So you have a middle school student in a departmentalized model seeing 7, 8, 9 instructors, educators a day. How do we have relationships with all kids in a 400-student middle school? And what the importance of a relationship and every student feeling like they have a champion. But when you focus in and you start to launch something or implement something, a learner profile leading to the use of along, trying to support the science, who has the relationship?
Yeah, I think, from the research, we know if kids have one important developmental relationship, that's enough to catalyze their learning and development. We don't want to limit it to one and say it's only one, right? Like, let's use some tools so there are more teachers who know more kids deeply, who think about it in relation to the content. But if we can make sure there is one, as you said, each student has a champion, has that deep relationship. And we know that from the research, there are certain structures we can put into place in schools, like advisories, classroom meeting, that support the development of that. We narrow the number of kids that a particular teacher is responsible for to make it possible to expand how many kids have a developmental relationship. So I think that there are sort of easy, tractionable ways to start as well, without saying, you have 180 kids in your calendar. It has to be all of them. Like show it to me exactly. But I think in addition, I think that there are other tools that we have available to teachers. Say, how relationship rich is my classroom, right? Because we want to create shared experiences for kids as well as individual personalized experiences for kids. And it's not just the teacher to the student, right? It's students to students, and teachers to families, kids to families, and it's like really looking at the web of relationships that we can create for kids, and it's not like, as you pointed out, holding every teacher accountable for that one relationship.
Great. So let's go deeper in this whole notion of helping every child have a champion. And Jilliam, we're going to bring this back to the topic that you raised. I mean, right now, teachers are going back to school, and in many states, there are new state laws that are attempting to dictate what kind of conversation they can have with kids, many of whom are exploring their own social, racial, cultural identity. And so, okay, teachers who have been juggling, 22 balls at once now have this additional very large ball that, is potentially landing on their head if they just raise the wrong topic. What's a teacher supposed to do right now about that?
Oh, yeah.
This
This is a hot topic. Well, I think that I won't say solution, but I do think we have to approach the topic of how educators address equity, anti-racism in the classroom very carefully, very thoughtfully, and from a few different approaches. One is what resources do educators have in place and are able to access to support these conversations and to do these conversations in a way that isn't harmful to children, especially children of color. I think also we have to think about how we have these conversations and create spaces for families to engage in these conversations, because we know that we get pushback from parents. Parents have great agency and advocacy, right? But in order for children and for teachers to feel safe and to feel confident in having these conversations, and sometimes not getting it right, families have to be on board as well. And then, from a leadership perspective, school leaders have to create structures and have to create environments and a culture in the school where it is okay to start to have these conversations at a school level. And I would love for you, Scott, to speak to that if you can. But yeah, I think it's going to be difficult. As we were developing our teaching framework and thinking about equity consciousness as a competency, our internal subject matter experts, most of whom are white, they agreed that this is going to be hard, but it's also going to be a very necessary journey that educators must take, and it's lifelong, right? We will never get to a place where we have mastered equity, where we've mastered anti-racism. It's a process. And so again, my question is, what are the school structures and policies that we will put in place to sort of counteract state legislation, for example, that would stymie these conversations and sort of also just perpetuate racism in classrooms and white supremacy in curriculum. So,
yeah, we believe wholeheartedly that a district, a network, a leader, a group of leaders, a group of teachers need to make a mark and make a stamp on who they are and what they're showing up to do for their kids. We are wholeheartedly saying we are building an anti-racist classroom and network in our schools and making sure that we're dismantling white supremacy culture in everything we do. How do we do that is deep development, awareness, sensitivity training, bias awareness. And so we've been on that journey with leaders because we realized very quickly that we as leaders needed the development and the tools and the resources to be able to help influence and support our teachers and our staff across our buildings to then model for students how to create that safe, inviting, inclusive space in our classrooms. We know critical race theory is a big topic right now. We know culturally relevant teaching practices is being thought of as critical race theory, and they're two completely separate things in the way that we're showing up from an instructional practice or delivery standpoint. And then how we're, thinking about recovering and supporting 400 years of systemic racism at the same time. And so it's real and it's evident, and some people are going to talk about it and some people are not going to talk about it. And I think regardless of political values, beliefs, views, we as educators serving Black and brown students in historically marginalized communities have to show up right now. And I hope many people will have started to show up many years ago, and we know that that's not the case. And I'm proud of our team and the work that we've done since 2016, 2017, not just in response to a COVID pandemic and racial injustice, but it's so urgent right now in the way that we need to show up. Urgency being a white supremacy characteristic, and so we have to balance that. But relationships are going to drive so much of that work, and if we can create the relationships to have those conversations and have school leaders and school districts and school networks support leaders and teachers to have those conversations, it starts with developing awareness, bias, sensitivity of teachers. Sympathy versus empathy has been a big part of our work that catalyzed us to think about bias training and to think about what teachers are saying and doing in classrooms that are actually dividing the relationship or making a divisive classroom because of the way teachers are unintentionally showing up with language, values, approach in the classroom and the way they deliver instruction and the way they build relationships.
And sorry, Christina. One thing I'll also add is that, while race-based equity is important, it is not all of equity. It's not all that we need to address in terms of equitable educational opportunities for children. Although historically it is certainly at the top of the list. And so what we've worked with schools in doing in terms of their whole school transformation is thinking about helping them to think about and identify what are the key groups of children who absolutely need who are impacted the most by inequitable educational practices, and what is this innovation, personalized learning in particular, going to do to help them. And so I think it's important to broaden our scope a little bit more to include other groups, other groups, other non-white groups, other race-based groups, LGBTQ, for example, religious groups who walk into classrooms and feel unseen, and their identity is not appreciated and valued in that space, and how can we help them?
So, Christina, I'd love to turn to you now, the scientist here. Might there be a role for the emerging science of relationships and their importance to learning in confronting all of those state laws and saying, actually the science says that the quality of these developmental relationships depends on a degree of sharing and vulnerability and all the things that would go into having conversations that are in some places now being outlawed. I mean,
Yeah, absolutely, right? If the science tells us that we need to ground in relationships, we need to be rooted in relationships, that's going to catalyze healthy learning and development. So if we want to accelerate learning to deal with all the complications of this past year, we have to ground in relationships. And imagine a teacher forming a relationship with a student and denying a particular characteristic of that student that influences how they live in the world and their experiences in the world. So we say to a teacher, you can't talk to kids about their race, you can't talk to them about their racial experiences. And to Jilliam's point, it's race, the structural inequities in school are racist, classist, ableist, gender-based, right? And if we deny the identity of kids, how can we actually form a trusting relationship where that student is going to be willing to engage with us? So it's like, if we take that away, like we've essentially instantiated the system that already exists, right? And saying we don't value, we don't respect you, but it's like that valuing and respecting opens the door for learning and allows kids to actually be their full selves in school, bring us to recognize their assets in school, and move from that place forward with kids.
Yeah, I was just going to add, when we think about equity, we're thinking about all children. And so one of the things we wanted to be really thoughtful about is like, what are the resources that teachers are using in the classroom, and how have we made sure that those are vetted for all students? And so one of the things we thought about when we were building the content for Along was, how can we partner with organizations so that every single one of these questions, every single one of these resources has gone through a vetting process to make sure that it's racially and culturally affirming, that it's available and accessible for exceptional learners. And so we partnered with a number of organizations, Understood.org, Search Institute, Black Teacher Collaborative, to really get not only educator perspectives, but researcher perspectives and folks who are really thinking about this, because equity just has to be at the basis of all of these things. How do we make sure all students have access to the resources that we're using in the classroom?
Can I add one more thing?
Oh, yeah, sure.
From a science perspective, I just wanted to add one other thing. Like, relationships are the best experience of positive context because it creates that rich experience, that quality experience for a student to develop that positive neural architecture. But relationships also buffer against negative experiences. And the racial trauma that many kids have faced that has been highlighted in the news this past year is buffered by relationships. Like, having a relationship releases oxytocin, which combats the negative effects of cortisol and stress, right? So it's both positive and a buffering experience. So there's another layer of science, if we want to go down deeper into it, about just how important relationships are to managing the racial reckoning we're having right now.
Cool. So the power of your deep relationships produces more oxytocin, more good hormones, more good. I mean, there really is a biochemical thing that happens here.
Exactly. It
Yeah.
protects us at the cellular level from the effects of stress from cortisol that happen. And we know that racial trauma is a type of adverse experience that many kids have. And so the release of oxytocin actually changes us at the cellular level and can protect us from that stress and adversity.
Yeah, great. Okay, so we're going to do 2 really fast lightning rounds in our last 6 minutes. First question, and we'll start here and go there, and then next one we'll start there and go here. Thinking about how the practitioners who are here can go back to their schools and districts and say, all right, yeah, here's an idea for how we could structure and scaffold to make this a thing in our place. What's an idea for what that would look like? What would you suggest?
Yeah, so I think designing with and not for, making sure teachers are a part of the conversation for what you're designing and the reason why you're designing this. I think setting up time and space in a day every single week. It's not just a time and a place where you're only doing it then, but having protected time for teachers to be able to really dive into relationships, have tools. And then I think mentoring, empathy interviews, the use of a learner profile is a really great way to start this work. Beyond that, we do need frameworks, we need tools, we need rubrics, we need essential questions, and we need identified ways to be able to continue the work beyond just entering it.
Did he just answer for all of you?
Yeah.
Any of you want to add something to that?
I'm just going to give a shout out. One of the tools we developed at Turnaround this year was a well-being index, and it's a way of giving teachers insight into the well-being of their students. So it's a quick, short assessment that teachers can do on a regular basis to get an insight into how the kid is feeling and functioning, and they can use that as a jumping off point for relationships. So if we want to be personalizing experiences for kids, this is a good way to start doing that.
Great. Samia, what's the core advice that you send to your practitioners across your sprawling network?
Yeah. We say we want to help you with the how. This is what we want to be able to offer to you is we hear so much about, and I've sat in a lot of panels the past couple of days talking about how important it is to have students open up and how we want to hear from them, but we really want to offer the how. How do I fit this into my day? How do I fit this into my week? Where do I start? And so what we really offer to them is we want to hear your feedback. You can sign up along.org. We are available for free to educators, and we want to hear from them. We want to say, what is making this fit into your classroom, and what are you hearing from students, and what are you offering back? How do we get that process of shared reflection to actually be built into your day? Yeah, for all kids.
Great. Okay. All right. Last lightning round. Somewhere in this room, there's a philanthropist who corrals you as you walk out and says, I love what you had to say. I'm going to write you a check tomorrow for the research project that will deepen and extend this work. Raise your hand out there because they're going to be looking for you. So what do you say? What's your answer? Where should we go next in all this? We'll start with Jilliam.
Oh boy, I get to design the research project of my dreams. Okay. Well, so I've heard at this conference quite a bit about systems change, and so I'm interested. I would advise that philanthropist to invest in research that is going to look at how all of what has been said today on this panel, both at a micro and a macro level, affects the child's learning experience, and not just the child. So we talk about systems and structures at the school level, at the district level, at the state level, and then back down to the classroom level. How all of these characteristics, how all of these pieces of the ecosystem work together to impact from a relational perspective, impact the child's learning experience and trajectory, and not just the child, but then the family. So what are the long-term outcomes associated with building, with addressing systemic change, building strong structures at the school level and the classroom level to really impact the quality of relationships and the downstream impact on, therefore, then on academics and social and emotional development, and then long-term outcomes in terms of economic outcomes. And so that would be the research project of my dreams. Somebody fund it.
Wow. I mean, I was asking for the idea, but we got the whole proposal right there.
And I would say distinctive schools will pilot and prototype to get all the research for Jilliam.
You're on, Christina?
I'll just ditto what Jilliam said. I think we want to move forward in a way that we're looking at the context. How are we creating the conditions for students to thrive? And then look at the student in there and look at the relationship between the student and the context. So I'm going to steal something from Scott, and I think we want to be looking at here are the conditions, and here is each individual student through a learner profile. Let's look at that student holistically, and then let's look at the conditions and understand that there isn't a one-size-fits-all. It's not a checklist. Do these things in this order, and you've gotten there. But like, how is the condition? How is the child experiencing those conditions, and how is it accelerating their learning and growth? And let's look at all individual kids in that and adjust accordingly to each individual context and community.
Great.
And I think let's just keep investing in figuring out how to make it feel accessible to teachers, right? How do I actually do this? How do I make this practical? I think that at the end of the day is just going to be the most important for us to take that research and make it really practical. That's what we're trying to do, and I'd love to see like everyone continue to spend time in that area. Yeah.
And can I summarize, because I love doing that?
Please.
Not to
We all
take your
just make
job.
ditto.
Yeah, okay.
But, what I'm hearing is, we need to invest in more research to understand what works for whom, right, and under what conditions. That's essentially what we need in this space, because to your point, it's not one size fits all. It's like, what does this individual child need, and what will allow this individual child to thrive from a conditions perspective, from an interpersonal perspective, intrapersonal perspective, and how can we resource this child's pathway to ensure that they thrive.
And would Chicago be a good place to do that?
Chicago would be a
10-4.
great
10-4.
place to do that. Yeah.
Please give it up for this all-star.
Thank you.